Hello, Redsock here. This video is a demonstration of a 2-box on Dungeons & Dragons Online DDO. We're going to be doing this using a dual-wielding setup, using mouse in one hand and keyboard in the other. I've already recorded the gameplay footage, and what I'm going to go through is I'm going to commentate on it and point out anything that is I consider to be kind of relevant. So this dungeon is particularly noteworthy because, as you might be able to see by the UI element here, it is intended that this can only be completed by 4 people. It can be done with 2 though, as we will demonstrate in a moment with hirelings. It can actually be done with 1 person if you like, if you're set up to do it properly. There are lots of different ways to clear this in 1 person. But I thought it would kind of be a good demonstration of where a 2-box could be valuable. We're going to be doing this on Reaper difficulty, only 1 skull, but sort of like the lowest tier of the highest difficulty level for people unfamiliar. So, here we go. I'm going to put both in by clicking enter, and immediately there is already a trick being used. See, in DDO, when you're in a loading screen, it doesn't actually need all that time to load the world. The world actually loads in very, very quickly. And when the world is loaded in, it actually gives you control of your character. So you can actually have, like for most of this bar filling up, you actually have control of your characters. What I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be mashing 0. If you look in kind of like these 2 regions here, the moment that the sort of screen pops up, you might be able to see the summoning bar, which started part way through. By mashing 0, which just so happened to be my summon hireling key, I'm able to sort of skip a couple of seconds of the animation, and those are kind of 2 seconds of frustration at the beginning of every dungeon. So this is a pretty minor trick, but useful to know. The composition here we're going with is that on the left-hand side you can see that I am running an Enlightened Spirit Warlock that is kind of behaving as a tanky character. I hesitate to say tank because that's not really what we do in DDO, but a tanky character, and then a kind of an artillery character here. That is a rogue mechanic build using a great crossbow. So here's where this dungeon requires 4 people. For people unfamiliar with the dungeon, there are these pads here. After you clear the initial room, there's a pad there, and there's kind of like a pad there. You can kind of see it a bit more on the other screen. And you can see these kind of runes floating up above it. The idea is that you need to have 4 players stand on these pads. There's 2 here and there's 2 in another room. Then, as soon as 4 players do so, the grating you can see in the distance there blazes, and another grating falls down, separating the party. By using hirelings, we can get around the restriction to 4 people. So what you're going to see here is that I move one of my characters. I think I just got there's a couple more whites here that I noticed lurking in the shadows. And there's another one. Let him die, let him die, let him die. And I'm going to park one character on there, and then you can see that I'm pushing the follow button on the hireling bar, and then setting him to wait. The follow button immediately teleports your hireling to you, and wait makes him sit there, and that triggers the runes. So what I can then do is I can go into the other room, as we see here. Park characters on the tiles. You can see that I got a little bit mixed up with the other character. More on that in a bit later. Remember that I am operating this. There is no follow in this game. I am operating this independently. I can then hit the follow, and they'll teleport even through like brick walls. Mercifully, in this dungeon, you don't actually have to do anything on the other side in order to progress. The 2 paths kind of meet up. And when they meet up, you don't need like, oh, we need to pull a lever on both sides or something to get the door open. You can just progress through. If you've got a way of doing this, people do this casually in the game all the time when they run this dungeon. So onwards we go. Generally speaking, the play here is that I'm moving the tank up ahead. The artillery piece, so to speak, is doing anything that needs to be doing in the room in order to speed it up. When the tank positions themselves in a location where they're going to get aggro quite quickly on any mobs that I know are spawning. In this room, we're going to demonstrate why that's a good idea, because we're just wandering around, and then suddenly, oh, there's a Carnage Reaper. For people unfamiliar, this nefarious little creature here is a Carnage Reaper. The main problem on Reaper difficulty, as opposed to like Elite difficulty, is that these, at least at low skulls and the lower tiers, is that these Carnage Reaper spawns. This is for people who haven't played the game before. They do a lot of damage, and they have this awful habit of teleporting in. They can spawn on top of any monster spawn. So what's happening here is that actually one of them has spawned on where you can see these arrows coming from. There's a bunch of skeleton archers. Carnage Reaper spawns on top of a skeleton archer and then goes, oh wait, I can't path to the PCs. Well, that's no good. And then just teleports on top of you. But this ends up going fine because I've got this nice tanky character that can survive it. You can see here, look, that this is done like 53 points of damage in one hit. That's a quarter of the tank's health in one hit, and that could have been significantly more as well. If you give them a chance, Carnage Reapers will shred you, particularly as you go into higher skulls. But because I've got this tank that's picking up aggro almost immediately as he spawned in, it doesn't go on the far more squishy piece of artillery, for whom this would be a lot more damage, because it's got less physical resistance. So the idea is scoop up the Carnage Reaper for long enough to survive, for the artillery to blast him into oblivion, which doesn't take very long because we do a lot of damage at this level. That'll be a lot nastier on higher, on both like sort of higher experience levels, as well as on higher tiers of skulls. I now end up very carefully. I mean, this kind of might look quite simple. But one of the reasons that I'm commentating after the fact here is because this is a feat of concentration to pull this off. I'm moving both characters at the same time using different hands. And in that particular area, if you fall off that little bridge, then that's going to be a long time. So there's actually an amount of delicacy that goes into this. Here I position the tank behind one of the pillars in order to sort of tank all these enemies and kill them, while the mechanic deals with these levers to get the door open. A small mistake here. What I could have done there is actually, instead of parking the tank behind that pillar so it's not under attack from the archers, I could have actually used it as a human, or I suppose dwarven shield there, so just to pull the lever a bit faster. Right, here is where we encounter our second Reaper, if memory serves. Yes, here we go. So I noticed, I kind of was moving cautiously into this room because I knew the enemies were going to spawn. I did not know, because you never know when the Reaper's going to appear. You can see the Reaper has turned up there. The Fear Reaper is the least scary of the bunch. But it's still a Reaper, so it still wants to die. So immediately I devise my plan. My plan is that the tank is going to draw these enemies just to the side and kind of just face tank them there. Once it's got aggro, there we go, and the rogue is going to move sort of like on a line perpendicularly to be able to get an angle so he can get in on that Fear Reaper, snipe the Fear Reaper down, and then he can turn his attention back there. Again, one of the advantages of using the Warlock is that the Warlock does not have much work to do. Like, all of his attacks are AoEs. He's got these radiating temporary hit points. He can perfectly happily sort of like do stuff without any more supervision other than me just sort of mashing my attack button. What you see me do here is another sort of technique. True story, for people unfamiliar with this game, it works a little bit different to other MMOs in that everything has collision. You don't collide with other PCs, but aside from that, you collide with every other creature in the game, and enemies collide with other enemies, and enemies collide with you. Which means that if I park my tank directly in the middle of this door, these melee wights that are going to try and get in on my squishy-ish crossbowmen are unable to get through the tank because I'm blocking them. This is a trick you can use all over the place. Most doors in DDO are narrow enough that you can pull this off. It is actually remarkable what you can survive by doing this. It's almost kind of even works. It works really well if you put persistent area effects, sort of like web or firewall or whatever. Drop those in there. The Warlock will eventually gain access to Everard's tentacles, which will be super effective at that. It's almost even better when the guy at the back gets aggro, because they'll try and move past, but they won't attack the guy in front. Very, very effective. If you pull it off correctly, and you might see that my character is not on the dot. Is not quite on the dot. and that wight manages to sneak through. But even though that's sad that happened, it was still a useful technique because it still provided a choke point. Only one managed to slip through. On higher difficulties, on higher level dungeons where everything's a little bit spicier, and the packs of enemies are larger as you go to higher levels as well, this technique gets even more useful. If there's large numbers of enemies, they just get choked up and they're not even able to get in melee hits. It's very, very safe, particularly as, again I stress, we're worried about Reapers here. Particularly when there's large numbers of enemies and you might end up seeing, if you're unlucky, you might end up seeing 2, maybe even 3 Reapers in an encounter. Having the Reapers get choked up in enemies is a good thing. Here you can see that one of the Gallows Wights I don't spot. They all try and stealth, which is a problem. And you'll notice that my instant reaction is to try and back up. Now, partially that's kind of, you might think, well, that's a natural reaction. Everybody in an MMO like backs up, but there's actually kind of a purpose here. Backpedaling is very, very safe. You see, when you're fighting melee creatures in DDO, when they try and attack you, they aim their attack at the location you are at the beginning of their animation. But as you can kind of see, their animations take a while. Certainly enough time so that if you're moving backwards, you might not be there when the attack actually lands, because the hitbox appears at the end of the animation. So by backing up when you're under attack by melee things, you're giving yourself a chance at avoiding the attack just through dodging it, as opposed to like making the AC check or like the concealment check or whatever layer of defense that you have in the game. So onwards we go. Again, I know that there's creatures in here. As soon as when I know there's creatures coming, again, positioning the tank to kind of act as the linchpin. You can see that quite a large number of wights get in here. They would be doing a lot of damage, but they kind of get choked up on me. These hirelings kind of act as almost like bollards. Because the tank is radiating so much aggro with that aura. You could do this with a warlock, you could also do this with a barbarian, using lots of cleaves. They're not aggroing on the mercenaries, so the hirelings that are floating around. So they're kind of trying to get around the hirelings, which gives me a couple precious fragments of a second where they're not attacking me. It can be very, very useful on higher levels where these enemies are a lot more dangerous. This next bit, so what you're going to notice here is that there's a trap coming up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put my followers. That's why there's a little bit of hesitation here, as I realise that I haven't planned this out perfectly. My followers I'm going to stick on... I don't actually, sorry, no, I screw up. What I would have wanted to do there was I wanted to stick my followers on wait mode at the beginning of the trap. This is a slight mistake. Basically, that is the reason that you had hesitation at the beginning is because this basically occurred to me during the moment, and then I realised, oh nuts, I haven't keybound that. This is sort of a theme that I think I find with DDO boxing. Almost everything you do where you encounter small frustration, like, oh, right, I've got to actually go down and click that, that's quite irritating, can usually be solved by some sort of additional keybind. And by playing characters that don't have a lot of active keybindings needed in either their rotation or their utility or whatever. These characters fundamentally do what they do largely by auto-attacking and mashing a few buttons in the case of the Warlock. You can devote as many keybinds as possible to nice situational things. So ideally what I'd want to add is a keybind to this kind of, to the wait/move toggle. And I also definitely want a keybind for the follow keybind. What I'd have ideally done there is I'd have gone wait to the hirelings at the beginning of that trap gauntlet. I'd have run through and then I'd have pressed follow afterwards. You'll notice that I took a bunch of damage from the traps, in spite of the fact that I tried to soak up the hits using the tank. Here is where I kind of have a slight panic moment, where I realise, okay, I'm damaged and I'm not receiving any healing. These guys will eventually be able to self-heal, but their self-healing capabilities isn't at full whack at the moment. I'm kind of relying on my hirelings to heal me at this stage, and they're not doing it. It's at this moment I realise that I haven't toggled aggressive mode on. Ideally what I'd have wanted to do is in my keybind that I mash at the beginning to summon my hireling, I could have keybound the aggressive mode on, and I could have put that keybind into my mash button so that I could create an ISBoxer, a big long keybind that summons the hirelings and sends aggressive mode on and casts all my buffs at the beginning of the dungeon. Using whatever keystrokes are necessary to do that. ISBoxer would perfectly happily create a big long keybind if you know how to use it that performs that task. That is a small improvement that could be made there. By having aggressive mode on, the hirelings are going to be much more willing to heal. In that moment, I use the lever for a bit of cover to not make the mistake I did earlier. I don't need the dwarven tank there. I can hide behind the lever itself to hide from the arrows. Though the bleed effect they put on me was what was interrupting me pulling the lever. That was quite irritating. Here's the boss of this dungeon. It's not particularly difficult. Sort of around about the time at which they produced the first expansion, they kind of realized that bosses need like literally about 10 times as many hit points as they have right now in order to be even vaguely interesting. So these dungeons from early on in the lifespan of DDO, the bosses tend to be a bit easy. So I didn't need to necessarily employ strategy there. But a nice, neat clear. So that worked. That was about an 8-minute run in terms of the dungeon itself. Obviously, I've been pausing it from now and again so that I can discuss it. But that was about an 8-minute dungeon run, which is not an unreasonable amount of time to clear this in. Obviously, 2 people working independently of each other would have been able to do it faster. There's probably about a minute or so I could have even shaved off there if I'd have had my keybind set up. There's also one other sort of like interesting little issue that if I just go back and if I can just find the moment, I think it's around about here. Yes, and if I just lead into it, I can demonstrate one other issue that soaks some time. I'm generally getting pretty happy with the idea that of moving around the characters, but you might see here, particularly on the left-hand side. I mean, we're waiting for the fight to trigger here, but once I've pull the lever there and this little fight triggers, I now want to walk through the door and I get lost, and I spend kind of 10 seconds on the guy on the left kind of navigating where the exit is. This is a symptom of how I've chosen to set up the screen. So I'm using this kind of like split screen vertically system. The reason I do that rather than use 2 screens is because it's just a lot easier to flick your eye from screen to screen from side to side of a single screen, rather than having to actually pivot my head to look between them. Particularly when you're trying to literally move them at the same time, you've kind of got to do this slightly kind of like fighter pilot-y kind of thing, where you've got half an eye on each screen at the same time. It's quite challenging at first. Like when I first came up with this idea and started doing it, it was not natural to me, but a little bit of practice, like, you know, after the first sort of like half an hour or so, you're starting to gradually move your folks around confidently, and as I play more and more and more, you just get more and more confident with the system. It's a very different style of multi-boxing to conventional multi-boxing, I would say. Usually with multi-boxing, kind of like most of the difficulty ends up happening before the encounters, right? If I was multi-boxing World of Warcraft, RIP, then what I would end up doing is I'd usually end up spending hours in ISBoxer and meditating about builds and like compositions and whatnot, to come up with a set of ISBoxer keybinds or whatnot. And most of the kind of like thought and heavy lifting goes into that, and that's kind of the hard bit, and then executing it is reasonably simple. Of course, there's always content in things like World of Warcraft where, like, well, you know, if you're doing like a Mythic plus 15, that's not easy to pull off on a multi-box, no matter how good your keybinds are. So some execution comes into it, but generally speaking, for like the low level of play, so to speak, a lot of the preparation comes in beforehand. With DDO, you kind of, this goes for things like Guild Wars 2 as well, if you try and multi-box that. There's kind of a slight joy in getting better at it, because because setting this up is really simple, and then executing it is actually quite challenging. So there is this sense of like personal progression as you get better at something. I get the same kind of buzz from this as I get from playing like an RTS. It's not a style that I've seen many people doing online. Maybe a lot of people are doing this in the shadows. I don't know. But with people trying to find new games, like for example me, after the kind of sort of death of WoW multiboxing, or software multiboxing anyway, I thought people might appreciate a look into this. So thank you very much. If you like this, please give it a like, not because I care about the algorithm at all in the slightest, but just because I'd genuinely be interested to know if you liked it or not. Thank you very much. See you next time.